Very welcome. To you.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining online and also here. I'm very excited to be invited to this seminar series, of which I am a big fan, by the way. Okay, so I will talk now for about half an hour about this growing resistance against the digital technologies in education. And I hope I can also say something about how we can understand this shift, and also if there might be some pedagogical potential in it. So to begin with, the term digital backlash, or the concept, what do you mean by that? Well, those of you who are attending this seminar are probably well aware or well acquainted with the digitalization hype that to some extent have characterized the educational debate during at least the last 10 or 15 years. So the narrative has been more or less that schools need to keep up with society by becoming increasingly digitalized. It's also a way to make education more accessible, perhaps, or engaging or efficient. And as you all know, this is a narrative that to a large extent have also been pushed by commercial actors from the tech industry. So, but what has happened in the last 5 years, maybe, or 2, 3 more intensively, is that this narrative has been challenged by voices that are questioning the effects that digital media has on children and young people, especially then when it comes to their maybe cognitive development and well-being. And we have also seen some policy shifts addressing these concerns, both within the education sphere, but also outside the education sphere, targeting children and young people more in general. And as you see, I have a picture of a book here, which is kind of an introduction to this this phenomena of the digital backlash. That is, it's open access online, so you can read it. And I will go back to the motivations behind these concerns in education more specifically in a little while. But I just wanted to start now by saying that they differ a little bit from the more general backlash that is described very well in this book, which is more about people maybe starting to question the power of the global tech industry, the collection of personal data and so on, and the economic models. But these are not debates that are very present when it comes to education. It's other questions that are pushed there, that are more about the effects on the individual students and on their brains than on student integrity or more social political issues. But I will get back to this. I will just give some examples of these policy shifts that I mentioned. Many countries now have started to develop guidelines when it comes to children and young people in general, not just in schools and education. How much screen time is good for children of a certain age. And we also have this, which has been reported on a lot, the bans on social media that has started to be introduced in several countries, starting with Australia, which has been widely discussed. And the motivation here as well is that social media are addictive. They might have a negative effect on the mental health and the well-being of children and young people, and therefore they need to be regulated. But these policy changes, to some extent, do address the tech companies. Whereas when we look at policy reforms in education, so mainly then the mobile phones that are being implemented in schools worldwide. This is a map where you can see, I think it's about a year old or something. So the dark red areas are areas where they have a national ban on mobile phones in schools, and the pink ones are where it's like regional bans. But it's not updated because I don't know if you see, but there's some white parts in Europe, and actually recently, I don't know if you can see it, but there is a white part in Eastern Europe, but it's not accurate because Poland, Slovenia, Slovakia, Croatia, Moldavia, Romania, all these countries have during the recent year also introduced a national mobile phone ban. So I think it's more or less only Estonia that does not have a ban on mobile phones at the moment. So you see, this is a very, very widespread kind of policy reaction or expression of this digital backlash. And then we have more extreme countries like Sweden, where I live and work, that has taken a more extreme approach to these kind of concerns and are aiming to get rid of most digital schools and e-learning material, at least when it comes to the younger age groups, and also to reduce it for the older children. And what is concerning and maybe worth mentioning is that this includes also learning about digital media. So there has been a new suggestion for a new curricula in Sweden, and then digital literacy is very reduced or more or less removed when it comes to the primary school learning objectives. Yeah, so there are things going on at the policy level. But when you talk about these things, digital backlash, you often hear this question, well, isn't this just another moral panic? And I think this is probably a gut reaction we have, at least as critical researchers. You know, we start talking about concerns about young people and their media use and say that, oh, this is really bad for society and you know, cultural, would you say, dawn or something like that. That we want to see it in historical perspective, because as we all know, there has been concerns over all new media when they're introduced. We have the comic book. This first book here is about violent comics, which was, I mean, it's very, very aggressive in its critique against comics. And we had critique against video games and board games. That is very similar to the concerns that we now see against social media and for children and young people. So this is also a question. When we started thinking about this, me and my colleague Carina Geard, in a few years back in 2020, when we started to see this first signs of a digital backlash in Sweden, we asked ourselves this question: can this be defined as a moral panic, or how can we understand this critique? And to answer that, we started looking at the debate about children and screen time. And we did that using a framework that is developed by two researchers called Erik Gode and Nachman Ben Yehuda, who was drawing on the Cohen's definition of a moral panic to kind of distinguish it from other kinds of media debates, because of course we're debating media in the media all the time, but the moral panic is something specific. And I thought maybe it could be interesting to revisit this criteria now, 6 years later, when the digital backlash has become very manifest in Sweden as well as in many other places. So to begin with, and now I'll see if this works. I have a little problem here because I have an animation, but there's a text that's supposed to come, but it's not. Ah, here it comes. Okay, very good. Yes, so the first question is concern. Of course, it is a concern. It's a widespread concern over behavior or practice. And this concern is framed not only as a problem to the individual, but as a social problem. This is very important. But already here we can see a shift in the way that, or in the view of excessive or overuse of digital media. Because if we look just a few years back, it was framed much more as an individual problem that is supposed to be handled on an individual level through self-regulation practices. And this has been discussed very much in disconnection research, for example, on digital detox camps and so on. Yeah. So, but what we see now is when digital technologies are framed more as a threat to young people's learning, which is like then a broader social problem, they're also handled differently. So it's not enough to say that you need to handle your own media use or you have to handle your handle your children's media use, it has to be handled differently, which is on a policy level. So there has been a shift in the way that this concern is handled just during the last few years. The next characteristic is hostility, and the same applies to this, because what characterizes a moral panic is a certain kind of hostility or a specific group that is held responsible for this problem. And it's very common, or I would say it's almost a rule, that moral panics concern children and young people. They are the people at risk. But who are responsible for this? Yeah, well, we could see that take business as responsible, but they are not the one held responsible in many ways. It's often the parents, if it's young people, or teachers that are kind of held responsible for handling these concerns. And also here we can see a slight shift just happening in the last few years. I can give a quote here from the chapter that Carina and I wrote in 2020, where we said that, okay, although children and young people are still targeted at the object of concern, screen time panic, this debate about children and screen time, differs from earlier examples of moral panics that often led up to some kind of intervention on a societal level, such as legislation or action programs to be carried out in education and other institutions. Instead of promoting such public initiatives, screen time panic relies on the individual responsibility in line with the neoliberal ideology. And this was the case up until just recently. So maybe you can argue that it has become more of a moral panic in the last few years, and this has changed now in favor of more institutionalized policy responses. Okay, so the third criteria is consensus among the public that this is a threat. And this consensus come about as what Cohen calls socially accredited experts. And they are people who are given a lot of space in the media debate, and they use this to define what the problem is, more or less. And if we look at older moral panics, these experts have been coming from different fields. But what we can see today is that they come almost exclusively from fields such as neuroscience and educational psychology. And this is because these fields are perceived as more trustworthy and objective than, for example, social sciences or humanities. And this kind of trust has been described by Rose as a symptom of the center of biology. So where the body, and then especially the brain, is seen as foundational to all aspects of life and human behavior. And for education, then, this means that learning is increasingly being framed as a cognitive practice. That's something that takes place in the brain of the individual rather than a social or collective process. And neuroscience also sits well with the kind of neoliberal logic of optimization that underpins this shift. You know, that you have a plastic brain that can be reshaped if you train it properly or don't expose it to negative disturbances from digital media. And I mean, if we can train it to improve concentration and cognitive abilities, it's important in this case, because if we saw these abilities as conditioned by, for example, social structures or inequalities, that would demand other kinds of policy responses that we're not seeing. So there's a political aspect to this as well, and I will return to that shortly, because I will not say so much about the two remaining criteria, which are disproportionality, that the problem is exaggerated, and well, this is a difficult term, I think. Volatility, which means that something appears and then it disappears. I had to look this up. And the last one, naturally, because we don't know when it will disappear or if it will disappear. But more importantly, perhaps, this idea of disproportionality, because who are we to say that this is a disproportionate problem, right? I mean, to some extent, we can say that, yes, the digital backlash or debates about screen time, they are an example of a kind of a moral panic, or even maybe what Kirsten Dottner called a media panic. But if we just dismiss it as a moral panic, we dismiss what a lot of people perceive as a real and pressing problem. And Neil Selwyn stressed this in a recent debate about the digital backlash and said that we should be careful not to imagine ourselves as having superior or more sophisticated perspective on these issues, and we then being critical researchers. So because this growing resistance against children's use of digital technology, it's not just an effect of experts telling people what to think. It's also something that many people in their lived realities perceive as problematic. And so we need to take it seriously. But because of this, that the digital backlash is so popular and that it's underpinned by these very strong scientific truth claims, it can also be mobilized as a political tool to, win votes and elections. So let's move on to that term, namely politics. Another user took control. Oh, okay. Are they really examples of digitalizations, or are they symbolic practices? Because they're very difficult to implement in reality. So we have seen now in the last couple of months report, you can move on to some text there. Yeah, that many children under 15 still have social media accounts in Australia. And we also know that teachers have a hard time to implement mobile phone bans because it takes so much time and there's so much conflict maybe involved, and also because they might have like pedagogical ideas on why they want to keep mobile phones in the classroom. And it's also far from all digital technologies that are being regulated. Most policy reforms target, as we have said, private devices such as mobile phone, also private use of Gen AI, for example, and to some extent laptops and tablets, but not digital systems such as LLMs or other digital systems for administration and communication and monitoring in schools. But they are to a large extent left unchallenged. And this goes back to the arguments that are underpinning the digital backlash that I pointed to in the introduction, that the concern here is the assumed effects on digital tools on the individual student, not other possible issues such as collection of student data or teachers' workload or environmental issues or anything like that. So we can take the next slide. And this definition of what the problem is, you can say, is often legitimized through references to scientific evidence. That is quantitative studies of what happens, for example, in the brain, if you write by hand or if you write on a laptop. And this is, of course, an important perspective to take into account when it comes to learning. But what is more importantly here, again in the century of biology, is that it's also a very powerful truth claim, that you say that, okay, this is not just a perspective on learning that we can discuss, it's scientifically proven, so that's why we need to do this. And you can take the next slide. No, not next slide, yes, exactly. So Williamson, no, sorry, and colleagues, they refer to this process as scientization. That is the process of claiming authority from empirical evidence and scientific theory, often by mobilizing findings and concepts selectively according to particular interests and objectives. And these interests and objectives used to be in favor of digitalization, but now they are increasingly in favor of de-digitalization or digital regulation. But this also means that these interests and objectives, they can of course also differ between, for example, different national contexts. So similar problem of what the problem is with digital technologies, underpinned with similar references to scientific evidence, can be used to motivate very different politics and policy responses. And I thought we can become a little bit empirical and illustrate this by looking at how the digital backlash is played out into very different and to some extent extreme countries in Europe. Sweden, that I've already talked about as an extreme case of deep digitalization. And Estonia, that is taking, at least from the outside, path to continue digitalization. Now we can take the next slide. You can take another slide. Yes. So I will try not to become too detailed here, but we can talk more about it in the discussion. So if we begin with Estonia, this is a country that has invested a lot in digitalization. I mean, both in implementing digital systems for e-voting, etc., but also very, very targeted towards schools. And already in the 90s, they did a big project where they supported different kinds of internet access in schools and digital competence training initiatives. And as I said, they are, I think, the only country in Europe that is not implementing a mobile phone ban. And they also have this that you probably heard about, a big national state industry collaboration to provide all schools with access to a customized AI bot, collaboration with OpenAI. And Sweden, if you take the next one, yeah. As I said, they're not addressing AI in educational policy to any large extent, but rather push this rather aggressive digitalization policies. And that kind of started with, or I mean, the first big policy change that happened is that they stopped, and this is Swedish, but it says that the government is stopping the national digitalization strategies for schools. And that happened in 2023, and that was the start of a whole series of rather extreme digitalization policy reforms. So that's a very short kind of description of these two cases, but now let's look at how they are motivated with kind of similar arguments. So I've been doing some research with my colleague Emanuel Bardone on the AI leap in Estonia, and what was interesting here is that the people who are responsible for driving this continued digitalization, you can say, of the school system, are in fact also people from neuroscience and cognitive psychology that are also very, very concerned about what chatbots and LLMs do to learning. But instead of regulating it, they have then, as I said, developed this customized chatbot. You can take, I have a little quote there, which is motivated then with reference to neuroscience. So one of the persons responsible for this, they say that commercial LLMs, they put the brake on critical thinking and the learning process that takes place in the brain. So therefore, we need to make a customized bot, and that is now scientifically evaluated. Right, and this is Swedish, and it's a very small text, but under the image here of prior school minister Lotta Edholm, it says that this digitalization plan is not evidence-based. And there is a quote later on in this article that we can show, where they say that they reject this digitalization strategy on the basis of harsh criticism from medical doctors and brain scientists. Okay, so what can we make of this? Well, if we take the next image, we can say that on the one hand, references to science and evidence-based methods, they can be used to motivate political reforms. But what's interesting is maybe that the opposite also applies. Political reforms, especially if they're popular, as the mobile phone ban is, can also be used to promote certain perspectives of learning. And so again, when we did these interviews with the people involved in the AI leap, they referred to this as a Trojan horse, that they said, okay, this initiative of bringing AI into schools, maybe we're not in favor of it so much, but we can take this as an opportunity to push other kinds of perspectives on learning that we think are important, but that we might not have gotten recognition for before. So they say the AI leap is like a Trojan horse in the sense that we can make some changes that we think make sense, but now we can package them as, because of AI, we have to make these changes. And if we take the next slide, we can see that this applies also to the Swedish case. because where this widespread concern about digital media among children and young people, they have been used not only to reduce digital media in schools, but also to kind of break with a long tradition of sociocultural and progressive pedagogies that have been characterizing Swedish schools for a long time. So there's very much talk about this back to basics approach, and what that means is basically teacher-led education. Very much, we had talked these last 2 days about that research support to move away from transmissive learning methods, but this is not the case here. And then digitalization is used as a kind of vehicle to promote this more conservative pedagogies. But okay, so we can be skeptical against what this means, but I mean, to some extent, it means that the question is on the agenda, right? As critical researchers, we have long said that, okay, we need to talk about whether this digitalization is really good and what it's good for, and bring out more critical perspectives. So this means that perhaps the digital backlash can be used or seen as a pedagogical possibility to rethink the role of digital technologies in education. So I would like to end this presentation with some preliminary thoughts in that direction. When we start looking at this again, Carina and me, we looked at some popular science books on children and screen time, and when we looked at what they had to say about education, they were all saying, okay, of course, I'm not suggesting that we should digitalize schools. That would be like being against progress or something. But this has changed, right? So now we have a critical debate, but there's still perspectives that are not at all included in this debate, such as social and environmental consequences, dedication and user integrity, and the more situated perspectives and experiences of students and teachers, because these cognitive oriented perspectives are also they have this universal claims. I know we're a little bit short, but
carry on.
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to give 2 examples or a few examples of attempts to include this in the broader debate about digital technologies in education. And I think the concept of digital degrowth is very interesting here, because it addresses many of these blind spots when it comes to, for example, environmental concerns and also social inequalities. So very shortly, it challenges this idea of future education as just being more and more tech, and instead says, okay, maybe we shouldn't just regulate or remove technology, but maybe on an even broader scale, rethink our relation to technology and try to find a more scaled down and sustainable and maybe also situated or local relation to digital technologies in education. And we have some interesting initiatives, books, articles that are promoting this perspective. And I think it's 1 research program and 2 books, and they are all kind of taking a more holistic perspective on this. So either an interdisciplinary perspective or a more, addressing a broader audience, not only talking to other academics. Yes, and we can take the last slide, because I also wanted to mention that this kind of practice-oriented and a little bit future-oriented perspective is also one of the starting points for a conference that we're organizing this summer called Post-Digital Backlash, that I'm doing together with Petar Janvik and Mia Karapina in Zagreb, Croatia. And I mean, this has been interesting because it also shows that there is an interest in not only critiquing this backlash, but also actually taking this as point of departure to think about, okay, other things, can this be taken as a, productive starting point? And we have a lot of, teachers and students, their own backlash, and what can we make of that, and also environmental perspectives and so on. And these contributions will also be collected, or some of them will be collected in a book that will hopefully come out later this year, or maybe early 2027. So we hope this will also kind of contribute to a redirecting or broadening of this digital backlash. Yeah, thank you so much.